Hello and welcome to this video where we will be examining the model game between, coincidentally, two friends of mine, Niko Georgiadis and Shahriar Mamedjarov. After the usual starting moves of the Najdorf, knight f6, knight c3, a6, Niko chooses the move bishop e2. This game was played at the Biel tournament where Niko was the lowest rated player, and the tournament which was a stellar one for Mamedjarov, which he eventually won ahead of Magnus Carlsen. So I know Niko to be mostly a d4 player, so I was surprised that in Biel he was opening e4 and going for the main lines in most of the openings. So against the Najdorf, he chooses the line with bishop e2. The Najdorf is not Shahriar's main opening against e4, but he chooses it in this situation where he feels obliged to beat the rating outsider in a tournament where he needs to rack up a lot of points. So bishop e2 and e5. This is also our recommended move in the repertoire, the typical Najdorf move, e5, knight b3, and the players follow more or less mainstream theory. Bishop e3, bishop e6, and now queen, knight d5. A possible move, it's also possible to start with queen d3 first, but knight d5, the point of knight d5 is that black cannot really take on e4 because of the weakness of the b6 square. So bishop b6 followed by knight c7 is kind of devastating. Therefore, knight d7. Of course, it is possible to take on d5, but that would be premature. So knight d7 is a useful preparatory and developing move that covers the b6 square, and now attacks the e4 pawn. So queen d3 defending the pawn. It is worth noting that knight e7, taking the bishop pair, is not very dangerous for black, because after queen e7 he will quickly push through d5. I think there was a game by the Greenblatt computer against Bobby Fischer from 1977, if I'm right, where this line was played, and Bobby pushed through d5 and demolished the computer. Even though he had been retired by that point for 5 years, he still was more than superior to the artificial intelligence back in those days. So queen d3 and now bishop d5. Of course, now the pawn defended. White would like to continue with c4, strengthening the position of the knight on d5, so black uses the last moment to take on d5. Obviously taking with the knight is not possible, because then the bishop would be trapped on e6. Bishop d5, e5, and now rook c8. All these subtleties are explained in detail in the theoretical chapters. I will just repeat the most important points. The point of rook c8 is to postpone the short castle and discourage a long castle for white, because short castle will be made by g4, and rook c8 discourages long castle, because then black's counterplay can be really fast after b5, knight b6, and so on. So after c4, a natural move, white is connecting his pawns, advancing with his majority on the queen side, but on the other hand it indicates that long castle will not be happening, because then b5 would be strong, all of which means that black can simply castle short. White also castle short, and now we come to the first instructive moment in this game, and that is black's next move, which is the move knight e8. A multi-purpose move. The ideas are the following. Since black has a central and kingside majority, he wants to start by activating it. So the first idea of knight e8 is to push f5. The second idea is the strategically favorable exchange of the bishops. So the threat is to go bishop g5 and exchange the dark squared bishops. The structure in the center indicates that black's dark squared bishop is somewhat limited, which the same applies for white's light squared bishop, but that one is more difficult to exchange. So, knight e8. Of course, Nico understands what black's ideas are, and he goes queen d2. Again, a multi-purpose move. The first idea is on the king side, so the queen and the bishop control g5, so the white prevents bishop g5. The other idea is on the queen side. The queen from d2 eyes the a5 square, threatening the strategically favorable move, knight a5. Ideally, white would like to have a knight on a5 and then continue with b4, putting a rook on c1 and eventually pushing through with c5. Good understanding on the Najdorf is based on noticing these moments and preventing what is favorable for our opponent. Mamedyarov, of course, world-class player, knows these things and plays the move b6, controlling the a5 square. He will later follow it up with a5 and his queen side will be secure. Rook ac1, a natural move, putting the rook behind the pawn, and also after b6 the knight on b3 is kind of devoid of prospects. Liberates the a1 square, so the knight can be rerouted via a1, c2, possibly a3, b5, especially after black's next move, a5. And here we are at the start of the middle game. Black successfully defended his queen side and is ready to start activating his king side majority. Why I have chosen this game as a model game? The reason is that the apparent smoothness and simplicity with which black obtains winning position. And the apparent, when I say apparent, because it's not, it's, I would say, impossible to pinpoint a bad move by white. And yet, after some, let's say, now it's move 15, let's say after 5 moves, black has a strategically winning position. Now, how is that possible? Here lies not so much the secret, but the key to the understanding of these positions in the Najdorf. At first sight, white is doing great. Pair of bishops, queenside majority, all the pieces are nicely placed. And yet, the prospects of both players are quite different. White's prospects are difficult to define. What in fact is white going to do here? Whereas black's prospects are very easy to define and concretize. The knight will come to c5, he will push f5, try to exchange the dark squared bishop, start advancing with his own majority. What is white going to do against it? Again, not very clear. And this tendency inherent in this position is what makes it look so deceptively easy for black. But once you understand this, and maybe even more importantly feel this, you will start winning games in a very similar manner. So let's see how the game continues. Knight a1. Of course, the idea was, that was the idea of rook ac1. The knight will be rerouted c2, a3 and possibly b5. f5, black continues with his plan. The immediate threat is f4, winning the bishop. And now f3. Probably it was better to play f4, because f3 does stop the trapping of the bishop, but does not prevent the exchange of these dark squared bishops, which is, strategically speaking, very favorable for black. The alternative f4, it's worth investigating a bit. And now, for example, knight ef6, the move f4 weakened the e4 square, so the knight is going in that direction. Bishop f3 covering that square, but not for long, because after knight c5, black has excellent play. He can jump to e4, maybe even push e4, take on f4, put the bishop on f6 later on, and so on. You can see how in this position the knights are actually better than the bishops. The game move f3 allows the exchange of the bishops after f4. Of course, black should be very careful when making a move like f4, which can only be played if the following exchange, bishop f2, bishop h4, is guaranteed. Because if it's not, for example, let's imagine white king on h1, then after bishop g1, black will be left with a strategically bad position with the weaknesses on the light squares and a pretty bad dark squared bishop limited by its own pawns. However, the king is on g1, so bishop h4 does the work nicely. So bishop d3, normal move, trying to take control of the b1 h7 diagonal and activating the light squared bishops. And after the exchange, bishop f2, queen f2, the knight comes to the pretty nice square on c5. So these are the 5 moves I was talking about, and here I would dare say that black has a strategically winning position. Why so? Because he has a very clear plan. The plan we will see in the game. The knight from e8 will come to f5. And then from f5 and c5 the knights control all the important squares, e3, e4, d4, d3. Once the knight comes to f5, black will prepare the final assault by pushing the g-pawn. So g5, g4, and eventually creating attack against white's king. What can white do to prevent that? Nothing, unfortunately. The best he can do is stay passive with the knight on c2 covering e3 and d4 against the knight on f5. Exchanging that knight won't help much because after black takes on f5 he'll continue playing g5, g4. The knight on c2 can't really help. So after 20 moves, white did not make a single mistake. His moves were natural, understandable, he had ideas behind them, and yet he ended up in a strategically lost position. And yes, this is possible. It can happen in the Najdorf, especially in this type of position that we are currently exploring. I would stress the importance of understanding the developments and typical plans in this position, which can frequently arise from many actually lines in the Najdorf. So let's see how the game develops. Bishop c2. The bishop was attacked, so it moves back to c2. And now g6. Mamedyarov doesn't lose time. Knight g7, knight f5. Knight is coming to f5. Rook fe1. White intends to put the bishop on e4, plugging that hole, you could say, on e4, and the knight will come to c2 to cover the dark squares e3 and d4. It's a sensible defensive plan, but without any active prospects. Mamedyarov continues with his plan, knight g7, bishop e4, and now queen d7. He wants to come to f5 and maybe possibly take there with a queen. So knight c2, covering the sensitive squares e3, d4, knight f5, and now b3. Clear indication that white is going to just wait. Note that bishop f5 after queen f5 is bad because there would be a triple attack on d3. With one move, white cannot rescue all the 3 pieces. The rook on c1, e1, and queen on f2. Therefore b3, and now king h8. Mamedyarov is just playing really straightforwardly, following up his plan. g5, g4, liberating the g file for the rook. Rook b1. The rook is removed from the possible fork on d3, and also some active idea appears, which is a3 and b4. The rook on b1 defends the pawn on b3. And now a curious moment in this game happens. Up to here, Mamedyarov's play was straightforward, consistent, direct and strong. But now, instead of simply continuing with his plan with g5, followed by rook g8 and g4, for example, after bishop f5, queen f5, queen e2, preventing knight d3, and preventing g4 for the time being, but this is only temporary because after rook g8, h3, h5, g4 cannot be prevented any longer, and black will crash through. He would have obtained, by very simple means, a winning position instantly. Instead of that, he played a, for me at least, difficult to understand move, knight g7. I wonder why he moved the knight from f5, perhaps wanting to avoid the exchange, or difficult to say. And yet, even this is instructive from a certain perspective. After knight a3, white uses the opportunity to activate the knight from c2 to put it on b5. From b5 it will also control d4 in case it's required, and also will attack the d6 pawn. Mamedyarov now plays knight f5 again, threatening knight e3 or knight d4. White plays knight b5, improving the position of the knight. And what can we say? Black wasted 2 moves, so basically granted white 2 free moves, and he's still winning. Rook f6, defending the pawn, and finally starting the correct plan of g5 and g4. So black's position was that good that he could even grant 2 free moves to white and still be winning. This is just to show how good black's position was and how good it can become from the position we explored after the opening. So what can white do? Well, continue with his plan, a3 and b4. g5, finally getting going, and now knight c3. Difficult to say why he allowed the knight to come to d4. In a way, it was better just to take that knight and push b4. At least it was more consistent. Even though after knight d7, white can at least boast that he pushed the knight back. But then again, the c4 pawn is hanging, and the g4 idea is still in the air. Black is still winning, but at least white could have continued to put up some resistance. Whereas after knight c3, knight d4, the black knights are really very dominating. b3 is hanging, so b4 takes. The point being that after ab, knight d4, knight d4, rook g6, there is a double threat of g4, and the pawn on d4, pawn on c4 is hanging. Therefore, taking with the rook. Now the rook, the knight on c5 is now safe, but along the open b file, white is hoping to create some counterplay against the b6 pawn. However, g4 comes just in time, and black is crashing through. Queen h4. The queen is activated and tries with her presence to create some trouble for black on the king side by slowing down the advance. But after knight e4, eliminating possible threats against h7, knight e4, rook g6, black is crashing through on the king side because f3 cannot be defended, and additionally, by eliminating the bishop on e4, the fork knight c2 is available. Choosing the lesser evil, Nico chose fg, but after knight c2, it was basically game over, and the remaining moves were rook b6, knight e1, knight f6, queen g7, rook d6. This was probably played in time trouble, and now after rook h6, white will remain a whole rook down, and here he resigned. Again, very, very instructive game. I think one very important for understanding the whole actually set of typical positions arising in the structure after black plays e5 in the Najdorf, and white jumps to d5 with the knight, and after that exchange, a pawn appears on d5. It would pay a lot of dividends if you dedicate some time to study this game, perhaps analyze it yourself, and understand the typical moments, motives, reactions, and setups that arise in this structure. Great game by Mamedyarov, except for that strange moment of wasting 2 moves, but even that moment was in a way instructive, just showing the strength of Black's position in these structures. Thank you for watching. Hello and welcome to my video game analysis of the model game played between Peter Svidler and Denis Kismatulin. After the usual knight of moves, d4, c5, knight f3, d6, d4, takes, knight f6, knight c3, a6, Svidler played the move bishop e3, indicating his desire to play the English attack. After the normal moves, e5, knight b3, bishop e7, f3, bishop e6, queen d2, h5, we are following exactly the suggested move order in the theoretical part. As we mentioned there, here white is at a crossroads, his main question being in which side is he going to castle, long castle or short castle. With his next move, knight d5, Svidler indicates his preference for short castling in this game. Knight d5. Whenever a knight arrives on d5, it is black who is now at the crossroads, having to decide how to take on d5, with the bishop or with the knight. In the theoretical chapter, I argue that objectively both are possible, though objectively speaking it's better to take with the knight because this has the added benefit of keeping the bishop pair. So after ed, bishop f5, we arrive at the position where I showed that the strategically desirable move knight a5 in this position can be safely met by the move b6, thanks to the fact that the knight is still on b8, controlling c6, so white cannot invade on c6. Therefore, white plays bishop e2, and now a curious situation occurs. Black could have prevented white's knight a5 by playing b6, for example, himself, and then following up with a5. However, and that would have been conceptually, strategically good. However, he played the move knight d7. And now, coincidentally, we have a transposition in the line which normally starts, I'll go back to just show, we normally starts with bishop e2 first, and after knight d7, knight d5. And after knight d5, e d5, bishop f5, we have a transposition to the game. So, knight d7. And now, further strange things happen. White could have continued with knight a5, taking advantage of the fact that black did not prevent it, and black moved the b8 knight, so now b6 is not possible. After queen c8, short castle, we would have had a transposition to the game. However, white declines the invitation and plays short castle. Now again, black had the opportunity to play b6, preventing knight a5, or even a5, preventing knight a5, which would have been again strategically desirable. However, he decides not to and plays short castle himself. And now after finally this toing and froing, white takes up the opportunity and plays knight a5. I wonder what the players were thinking, what they were gaining from not playing knight a5 and not preventing knight a5. But after these small trickeries, we arrive at the position that we analyze in the theoretical chapter. This was the game I used as basis for the theoretical chapter because the defensive idea black employs in this game was the reason that this particular line allowing knight a5 is actually acceptable for black. So queen c8, the first step in the defensive play, not only defends b7 but also eyes the c2 pawn. And now Swidler reacts in the most straightforward way, c4. In the theoretical chapter we analyzed the superior move c3, but this game illustrates to show black's defensive idea in its full glory. c4, of course, is the most natural move to make because rook c1 before c5 is coming. But now we see the idea of black's defensive idea, which is the move bishop d8. The idea, the first idea, is to play bishop b6 and favorably exchange the dark squared bishops. And the second idea, thematic idea, is after b4, bishop b6 may still be possible, although c5 needs to be calculated. After b4, bishop a5, exchanging the annoying knight, and after ba5, the knight on c5 is on its eternal square. And black has excellent position. Please note that the bishop on f5 is very strong, controlling the b1 square, so white cannot use the b file. So Swidler, understanding this, does not play b4, but plays rook ac1 instead. Already having seen this idea of bishop a5, black places his knight on c5 safely. The point is again, if b4, bishop a5, with the same idea. The pawn is pinned, so it must take the bishop, and after something like queen c7 or rook e8 or any really sensible move, black has a great position thanks to the excellent positioning of his light pieces and his better structure. So instead of allowing that, Swidler tries to exchange the knight on c5. But this already, in a way, is admitting a failure of his opening strategy. Now black could have continued with b6, nothing wrong with that, continue with a5, and continue the game along the known paths, similar to the game Georgiadis Mamedyarov. However, Hismatulin wants more. He plays bishop b6. The idea is to not only to simplify or stabilize the queen side, but also obtain the strategically favorable exchange of the dark squared bishops. So bishop b6. And now this exchange cannot be prevented because knight b3 is threatened, attacking the queen and then changing the bishop. So Swidler at least accepts that he will have to make this undesirable exchange, but at the same time he sees as a possible compensation the fact that he will manage to advance on the queen side. So after knight c5, bishop c5, Swidler uses the fact that he can attack that bishop by b4, and even though this exchange will happen, he at least aims to push through c5. If he manages to do that, he will be doing quite alright, because this active play in the center and creation of a passed pawn will compensate for the nominally inferior bishop. Of course, that bishop can be exchanged most likely by queen d3, but for the time being, white's main idea is the push c5. This is also an important position to consider, because sometimes it can happen that we are faced with this impeding danger of c5 being pushed. And here, Hismatulin demonstrates a good way how to defend against this positional threat. The strong move here is a5. On one side, it's fight for the c5 square. Obviously, if ba5, rook a5, c5 is under black's control. The second idea is that by reducing the number of pawns on the queen side, black is easing the defense against c5. Let's illustrate this with moves. Why would the reduction of pawns ease the defense against c5? Well, one of the ideas is that after a3, which would be the normal move to keep the pawn on b4 so that c5 is played to full effect. AB opens the file for the a rook. The rook on a8, and the rook on a8 is developed without moving. An alternative is queen d8. So to wait with the opening of the file, because only black can open that file, the queen d8 move threatens b6 to take firmer control over c5, and c5 is not really very good for white now, because after dc5 the pawn on d5 is hanging. So white would be forced to take with a piece, but then this d5 pawn will not be as strong as in the case, for example, if white somehow manages to take bc5. So that's an alternative. But let's look at AB. AB, AB, and now queen d8. Similar to the previous note, the difference being that the a file is already open. As I said before, c5 is met by dc, and white is forced to take with a piece when the d5 pawn is easily controlled. If white could have taken with bc, for example, imagining a rook on d1, if white can play bc, then he would be close to winning. Unfortunately, that is not the case. Later in the game, we will see what happens in this position when the d5 pawn is isolated and cannot really advance. So, whichever way white takes, with a queen or a rook, this pawn is difficult to advance. So, for example, a rook c8 can happen after queen c5, or after rook c5, queen d6. And if white tries to take over the a file, black has the nice annoying move, you could say, queen h4. And the queen is quite active along the fourth rank. If c5, then b4 is hanging. There is maybe the idea of queen d4, ed4, and then the d4 pawn is kind of annoying after d3. And black has more than enough counterplay here. So these lines illustrate the possible ways how black can defend against this queenside advance of b4, c5. In the game, though, Svidler chose a different plan. He played the strategically horribly looking b5, but of course Svidler is a strong player, understands chess, so the idea was, of course, not to end up with an awful bishop and a backward pawn on c4, but he saw that he will inevitably push through c5. So black removes the queen from the c file, threatening b6 at the same time, and now white pushes c5. Obviously black takes, rook c5, and now we have the same, we have the position I was discussing before, the difference being that the a file is closed, and this is in white's favor because the rook on a8 is less active. With that being said, after queen d6, black is better here. Usually the queen is not a good blockading piece, but here it's an exception because it cannot be dislodged. The b7 pawn does a wonderful job controlling the c6 square, and the d5 pawn needs constant attention. The rook on c5 is therefore a bit awkwardly placed, needs to be defended, but even if white doubles on the c file, there are no entry points there. On the other hand, black can try and activate his own pawn majority. Of course, black's advantage here is not very big, and with good play, probably white should be able to keep the balance. And this being a rapid game, I decided to omit the rest of the game because it wasn't really of the highest quality, as opposed to the opening, which at least from black's perspective was of very high quality, demonstrating an important defensive idea. And that was the reason why I chose this model game, to demonstrate not only the defensive idea, but also the possible ways and explore a bit the positions where white actually had managed to put pawns on b4 and c4 and threaten the c5 push. So this concludes the analysis of the model game Svidler and Khismatulin. I think it's an important game, especially for understanding the mechanisms involved in the queenside play by both sides. Thank you for watching. Hello and welcome to the video analysis of the model game Anand-Vashirla-Graph. This game deals with the main line with bishop g5 and the improved poisoned pawn variation made popular exactly by Vashirla-Graph. So after the opening moves, typical for the Najdorf, bishop g5, e6, f4, h6, bishop h4, queen b6 is the starting point of the improved version of the poisoned pawn variation. a3, in the theoretical part we examine the moves queen d2, queen d3, which, to repeat, are pretty favorable for black, exactly because of the inclusion of the move h6. For all the details and subtleties, I will refer you to the theoretical chapter. So a3, bishop e7, bishop f2, queen c7, queen f3, knight d7, all these moves are natural, theoretical, and closely examined in the theoretical chapter. And here h4, Anand plays h4. We also analyzed in the theoretical chapter the move bishop g2. So h4, knight c5, bishop d3, and here we finally diverge from the theoretical chapter, but not so much in spirit, because the move played by Vashir in this game, knight d3, is closely related to our recommendation of d5, e5, knight e4. The move d5 is a bit more flexible because it keeps the possibility of exchanging the bishop on d3 for the most appropriate moment, whereas in this game Vashir took on d3 immediately, and after rook d3 played d5, e5 and knight e4. We can see now why this is slightly inferior, because the rook is already on d3 and there is no threat to take on c3. Still, the character of the position is very similar, so we will be examining how play develops in this type of position. Bishop e1. This does not only remove the bishop from a possible exchange on f2, but it also is a part of a deeper strategical plan, which involves the favorable for white exchange of the dark squared bishops. The structure resembles, or doesn't really resemble, it is a French structure, which has its own characteristics. The main one here is that white has a strong blockading knight on d4, and black has a relatively passive bishop on b7. Strategically speaking, black runs the risk here of ending up in a strategically hopeless position if, for example, white manages to exchange everything and leave knight on d4 against the bishop on b7 without any counterplay by black, for example, putting a pawn on b4, and then the bishop will be prisoner forever. Of course, this is far-fetched, but the long-term strategical dangers must be understood in order to be avoided. So bishop e1 steps on the path of this long-term favorable transformation for white, which is to play knight c e2 and then play bishop b4. After a possible exchange and ab, if black does not have anything in return, white will have obtained the ideal, you could say, setup. However, Vashir understands all these things perfectly, and we will see how he deals with these strategical threats. He starts with long castle. A typical idea in this line, because the king is removed from the center, will be tucked away on b8, and then the rook can come to c8 and operate along the semi-open c-file. So, relatively typical idea in this position. g5. White is combining his idea of knight c2, bishop b4 with play on the king side. And now Vashir decides to take on g5. It is possible to postpone that capture by g6, but this perhaps runs into some problems after white plays now or at a later stage the move h5. So in order to avoid these complications, black takes hg, hg, and now since white cannot really take on h8 because after rook h8 black will be controlling the h-file. Now plays the move queen b6. A typical move once the bishop has been removed from the g1 a7 diagonal. So the queen is more active on this diagonal and also liberates the c-file for a possible rook transfer. You could say king b8, rook c8, rook c4. Obviously not blundering the rook on h8, but a long-term idea. So, having opened the DH file, now Anand continues with his strategic plan of knight CE2. And now we start to see you could say the deep defense that Vachier had in mind. It starts with the logical and normal looking move king b8. Of course the king is removed from the c file just in case, and rook c8 will come next. Now let's take a look. In the game Anand continued with queen g2. Queen g2, perhaps threatening to take on h8 and push g6. But what happens if he tried to play directly following his strategical plan of exchanging the dark squared bishops? So in order to do that, he exchanges on h8 first and plays bishop b4. And now we see the idea Vachier had in mind, and he actually played this idea later in the game. Bishop b4. An alternative idea, actually, an alternative defensive idea, is to preserve this bishop and play something like bishop d8. And then the queen can move maybe even to a7, and then bishop b6. That would really be aesthetically pleasing with the queen on a7, exerting strong pressure on the g1 a7 diagonal. And if he can somehow even arrange a5, he would be doing great. But okay, this is an alternative idea to have in mind in these structures, but the most straightforward one is the one Vachier played. Bishop b4, it appears that this plays into white's hands, because after ab, it appears that the bishop will be dead forever, but the saving move is a5. So black is not allowing complete blockade along the dark squares, and after the exchange here, black is very active. There are threats on check on e1, check on a1, and now he has the option to activate the b8 bishop after b4 and bishop a6. This is very important. If black manages to activate the bishop, he's generally doing pretty good in this endgame. A funny line, of course, would be rook a3 and queen e1. So, going back to the game, queen g2. This liberates the third rank for the other rook, and also, apart from threatening g6, a threat is to play rook dh3 and win the h-file. So, g6, fixing the queen side. Now all play switches to the queen side, because there are no pawn breaks on the king side, so g6. So rook h8, and bishop b4. So Anand postponed this idea of bishop b4 by putting the queen by inserting queen g2 and g6. This has the additional idea of allowing the move rook h3 and winning over the h-file. But we already saw how we deal with this positional threat. Bishop b4, ab, and a5. This is the typical counterplay that you need to remember because it's a very powerful one and enables black very good counterplay, because it guarantees that he will not end up with a dead bishop forever. Rook h3, attacking the rook and winning the h-file, but now another instructive moment, rook c8. As I was talking, exchange of the heavy pieces favors white, because if the queens and the rooks are removed, then the two knights are clearly superior in this closed position because of the passive bishop on b8, especially if white manages to keep the block on b4, either by taking and pushing b4 or playing c3 and maintaining a pawn on b4. The bishop will be dead forever. Maybe this is still a draw because of some sort of a fortress, but definitely not a pleasurable task of having to play this position for hours on. So, in order to avoid it, black is keeping the heavy pieces on the board. he needs the heavy pieces for counterplay on the queen side. Queen h2. Black is fully controlling the h file, but there is nothing happening there, and the penetration along on h8 to exchange the rooks. Anand is continuing his own strategical aims, goals, which is to exchange the heavy pieces, is slow because Black manages to stir up enough counterplay on the other side of the board. So AB and Rook H8. AB, Rook H8. So he allowed AB, but that further makes it difficult for the bishop on b7 to be activated, because now the block on b4 is not a white pawn but a black pawn. So the b5 pawn cannot move to liberate the f1 a6 diagonal. So Anand is playing strategically understandable and clear chess. However, Black is in time to create counterplay with a fine move, Queen a7. So the threat is Queen a1, but also the queen remains on the g1 a7 diagonal in case White decides to defend by knight b3. So knight b3 will be met by Queen e3. Anand exchanges rooks, King c8, obviously not bishop c8, knight c6. So King c8 and now King b1. Is the only way to prevent Queen a1, but now the centralized knight has its say. Check, King c1, and going either back to e4 or, as Vachier chose, to f1. Doesn't really make a difference because the threat is Queen a1 mate, and White is forced to, actually both players are forced to repeat moves. Anand gave one check first, and now played King b1, and after knight d2, knight e4, again the threat is mate on a1, we have a repetition of moves and a draw was agreed. An important game for understanding the character of play and the subtleties in the positions which can easily arise from our suggested repertoire line. What I would like to stress in this game is Vachier's excellent defense against White's straightforward strategic plan of exchanging the dark squared bishops and establishing dark square control and blockade, which was at first sight playing into White's hands by taking on b4, but then following up strongly with a5, breaking down the blockade. And then also the importance of the keeping of the heavy pieces, which, as we saw in the end, the only remaining heavy piece, the queen, allowed Black enough counterplay to hold the balance and not suffer in some sort of endgame thanks to the passive bishop on b7. An instructive game, and I would suggest you go over it perhaps more slowly if you need to clarify some things for yourself, but generally these were the moments I wanted to draw your attention to. Thank you for watching. Hello and welcome to my Chessable Move Trainer course on the Najdorf. In this model game, played by between Neidich and world champion Magnus Carlsen, we will examine the Fianchetto line against the Najdorf. After e4 c5, knight f3 d6, d4 cd, knight d4, knight f6, knight c3 a6, Carlsen employing the Najdorf, Neidich chose the Fianchetto line with g3. The Fianchetto line nowadays is very popular and a regular guest at tournaments of all levels, so it is a line that requires certain attention because the probability of facing it is quite high. It is usually not as sharp as the other lines, but it does still have a fair amount of poison, and Black needs to know how to deal with it. So e5, the typical Najdorf move, and now knight b3. Obviously there are alternatives. There is knight d e2, even knight f3, and they are extensively dealt with in the theoretical chapter. After knight b3, bishop e7, bishop g2, short castle, Carlsen chooses the plan of starting with bishop e6. As I explained in the theoretical chapter, this actual game between Najditch and Carlsen was my inspiration to select this plan of bishop e6 against the line with knight b3 in the fianchetto variation. The alternative plan is, of course, the move b5. That is another way to treat this variation, but I just decided to follow Carlsen. Or perhaps Carlsen was following us, but then again, the repertoire was not in existence when this game was played. So we are following Carlsen, so bishop e6, and now rook e1. White can play a4 at any moment, black can play b5 at any moment, but it's best to finish the development first and then push b5. Knight b d7, and now knight d2. In the theoretical chapter, we are mainly looking at the move a4, which limits black's queenside expansion. But in this game, Najditch decided to not waste time on a4 and immediately embark on the typical maneuver, knight d2, knight f1, knight e3, with control over the d5 square. Certain parallels should be drawn with the almost identical line in the bishop e2 line, not the fianchetto but bishop e2. When the bishop later on comes to f3, white usually plays a4 there, and the knight maneuver, knight d2, knight f1, knight e3. This is all very well explained in the theoretical chapter, whereas here Najditch allows the move b5, which I think is an inferior choice, because allowing black comfortable b5 followed by knight b6, the mere fact that black manages to comfortably place his pieces in this way indicates that he has already excellent play. b5, knight f1, and now the first instructive move in this game, the move bishop g4. It's a very nice disruptive move. In a way, it is similar to the move bishop g4 I sort of invented in one of the lines. You will find it in the theoretical chapter. It's about in the line knight f3, in the fianchetto line with knight f3 and knight h4. The disruptive move, the idea of this disruptive move is that whatever white does, he's worsening his position. So sometimes it pays to play a move, even waste some time to worsen the position of our opponent. So now the queen on d2 would be pretty bad because it blocks the c1 bishop. The queen on d3 will run into knight c5. Bishop f3 is possible, even though it's not really clear white wants to weaken his king by exchanging these bishops. And that leaves white with move f3, which is rather ugly because it makes the bishop on g2 very passive and also weakens white's king. As we will see in this game, the king weakness is a long-term problem white will have in this game. After f3, the bishop goes back to e6, mission accomplished, because white's position has been weakened at the expense of two tempi. Knight e3, continuing with the plan, and now the move rook c8. Now, again, when games by great players are analyzed, it is never a move is never played just on general basis. There must always be something concrete, a concrete reason behind this move. Of course, it was possible to go knight b6. It would have been a normal move, natural move, controlling d5. But Carlsen uses a small tactical detail to include first the rook into the game. The tactical detail consists in the fact that the pawn on c2 is hanging in case white decides to put a knight on d5 and maintain a piece there. This is very important. So after knight d5, we already know that black would be very happy if a pawn arrives there, because then he has easy play. Now he also on the queen side, not only in the center and and the king side after bishop g6, f5, and so on. But also on the queen side, b4 can be annoying, knight b6, knight c4 can also be annoying. Obviously, the idea to exchange the dark squared bishops is always present. So, knight d5, and now the point is in bishop d5. Now, either while white will accept the fact that he must put a pawn on d5, after which black can probably play bishop g5, favorably exchanging the dark squared bishops, or maybe even f5, or lose a pawn after queen d5, rook c2. So now we see the tactical justification of the move rook c8. So this was the point. White cannot play knight d5 and maintain a piece on d5. Therefore, white played a3, preventing b4, and now knight b6. Now Carlsen takes over control over d5. We're at the start of the middle game. Both sides are almost finished with the development. This applies to white, who hasn't finished development. And we actually see that white has problems finishing development with the bishop, development of the bishop on c1. The problem is that the pretty knight on e3, which is on one hand ideally placed to control the light squares f5 and d5, on the other hand prevents the development of the bishop on c1. Putting the bishop on d2 doesn't accomplish anything, because the bishop, what does it do there? And leaving it on c1 is also not an option, because the rooks cannot be connected. So even this early in the game, on move 15, we can say that white's position is lacking prospects, as opposed to black's, who can continue to play constructive moves like queen c7, rook fd8, h6 is a useful move, and then depending on circumstances, knight c4, maybe push through d5. All these are possible. So with all these problems piling up that early in the opening, Nadic decides to play actively and play f4. Normally, the opening up of the game favors the better developed player, and here the better developed player is black. And the following move, in a way, is telling. Telling because Carlsen plays the move rook e8. Now, why do I say telling? Because obviously he understands the principle that opening up the game favors the better developed side. So, with this in mind, made sense to take on f4 and then play rook e8. So the game now is more open. The e-file can be cleared by bishop f8. The bishop can move to d7 and c6. And black will have excellent play against these two hanging pawns. But for some reason, Carlsen decides to go rook e8 and not open the e-file. Objectively speaking, it would have been better to open the file, but this also is good enough, because black's position is better even without further weaknesses in white's position after ef and gf. So now Nadic goes king h1, typical move in the Sicilian, removing the king from the vulnerable diagonal, but also passing the chance to not allow that possibility to black to open the game. So he could have gone f5 immediately, but Carlsen also declines the second chance to take e4 and goes bishop f8, after which white finally closes the position after f5. And now, in a similar parallel, after f5, the bishop is rerouted to the long diagonal, as in one of the lines of the English attack with h5. If you perhaps you would like to consult the theoretical chapter on that line, but where after f4, f5, the bishop from e6 is rerouted via d7 to c6 to attack the now vulnerable e4 pawn. Also from c6, the bishop controls d5 in the same way as from e6. White plays queen d3, developing the queen and also lending support to the e4 pawn. So h6. A somewhat mysterious move because the move is not exactly required at this point. Bishop c6 was okay. But a general move and in a way generally useful move and in a way waiting move as black wants to see how is white going to continue. What white does is that he decides to develop his bishop on b2, or at least giving himself the opportunity to put the bishop on b2 by playing the move b3. So apart from perhaps playing bishop b2, it also covers the c4 square. And now Carlsen continues with the move bishop c6. Knight still decides to put the bishop on d2, having covered c4, and now queen c7. What I find fascinating when analyzing Carlsen's games is that he always manages to find ways to improve his position. It appears as if he can do this forever. He always finds ways to improve the position of his pieces, improve something, even a little bit, in his position, and at the same time putting pressure on his opponent. So, queen c7. Again, it may appear like an automatic developing move, but the queen wants to go to b7, exert more pressure on e4. Then a rook can come to d8, the threat of d5 may appear. So there are always constructive things to do in the position, especially when analyzing Carlsen's games. A bit sad that the same thing doesn't happen when I play my own games, but that's a different topic. So queen c7 with the idea of queen b7. So rook ac1, white finally somehow managed to finish development, but look at this bishop on d2. Not a single square to go to. Rook ac1, defending against possible problems on the c file, and queen b7. Putting more pressure on e4, and perhaps introducing this idea of d5 with or without the support of a rook on d8. It looks like white is at some sort of a dead end here, no constructive moves left, so he decides to change the character of the position, not waiting for longer for black to continue improving by rook d8, possibly pushing d5. So he finally steps on d5, knight d5. Obviously, a white pawn will land on d5 after the exchange there, because black is controlling the d5 square too many times. And naturally he takes with the bishop, because taking with the knight would be bad, because then after ed the bishop would be relatively passive. So of course bishop d5, ed5, and now knight bd7. So the knight was very useful on b6 for a very long time, but after this exchange white is controlling d5 well enough, and the knight is now rerouted to greener pastures. Knight c5 is an idea, and also the idea that we will see in the game e4, and then knight coming to e5. Knight d1. White is also trying to improve his position. The knight can come to maybe to f2, still controlling e4, maybe to e3 to support c4. And now, as an illustration, for example, what can happen after knight e4, if white tries to establish a blockade over the e4 square, avoiding the continuation from the game, and a pretty good move is the move bishop e7. Not immediately exchanging, but activating the bishop and opening up new possibilities for it. One idea is to go knight e4, bishop g5 to exchange the force the favorable exchange of the dark squared bishops. And another idea, which we will see, of bishop e7 on the next move after knight d1, would have been the idea of improving the position of this bishop via d8 and b6. We have seen this idea of bishop d8 in the theoretical chapter in the Fianchetto line and in the line with knight b3, where white plays a4, and also in the theoretical chapter on the bishop e2 positional line, where white employed the plan with bishop f3 and a4. So this would have been a very nice way to continue to improve the position. Bishop d8, bishop b6. However, Carlsen made a more dynamic decision by pushing e4. So he pushes the passed pawn and also creates a vacant e5 square, which he will use for his knight. The pawn cannot be taken because knight c5 would be a fork and would win material. So queen d4, and the queen is taking the centralized square, which has been freed by the pawn advance, and now knight e5. The knight is being centralized and threatens knight f3. It was not very favorable for black actually to take the central pawn, because after this exchange the position is opened, the bishop pair now starts to count for something. And also this exchange for the e for the d pawn actually improved white's structure, because now black is left with a isolated pawn on d6. Therefore knight e5. And in this moment, with the tension rising, white actually cracks and commits a mistake. He goes knight f2, attacking the pawn on e4, but it was better to do it from c3, if only that the d5 pawn is defended. Even in this case, after knight f3, bishop f3, f3, black has the initiative, because the long-term problem of a weaker king, this that I mentioned earlier in this analysis, is still a valid factor. The pawn on f3 is not that easy to pick up, and any further transformations in the game, with any further transformations, white will have to be very, very careful about what happens with his king. Still, this was better than the move knight f2 played in the game, because after the same knight f3, knight f3, f3, now the d5 pawn is hanging and difficult to defend. With this exchange, white also lost the only positional factor in his favor, which was the bishop pair, and also this exchange further weakened the white king, because the main defender of the light squares has been exchanged. So the only move is to play c4 to defend the pawn, but after bc, rook e5 is a very nice move. It attacks the f5 pawn, but also threatens to double on d file. The justification here is that after rook e5, d5, queen e5, now the bishop on f8, which has been passive so far, is opened, and after bishop a3 is in a way characteristic line with white's position falling apart. So the rook is attacked. It cannot go to c2 because of queen b1 check, and the rook will be lost. And if the rook is moved elsewhere, the c4 pawn is falling. So why is this a characteristic line? Because this type of opening up of the position always favors the more compact side and the side with the safer king. You can see how white, all of a sudden, white is overextended, and all his weaknesses are beginning to tell. The king, the c4 pawn, the problematic rook. So this type of opening of a position can very often happen in the night off, and usually favors black, because he's normally the more compact side, and also psychologically it's easy for white to forget about a possible opening of the position, and white can easily overextend his position and then be punished when the position is opened. Therefore, after rook e5, knight is played rook e3, not taking the pawn, and now Carlsen chooses a transformation of the position as a way to realize his advantage. He could have taken the pawn, but instead he decides to take on e3, and after queen e3, attacking the pawn on f3 to penetrate queen b2. Again, it's white's overextended position that is suffering. There are simply too many weaknesses. The pawn on c4, the pawn on a3, the pieces are loose, and he cannot keep everything together. The only problem black has in this position is the passive bishop on f8, which cannot be easily included in the game, but luckily for black he doesn't need this bishop to obtain a winning advantage. So knight d3, attacking the queen, and queen a3, picking up the pawn, queen f3, and now queen a2. Again attacking the bishop, but also attacking the pawn on c4. White cannot defend both and decides to give up the pawn after bishop c3, rook c4, rook a1, getting away from the pin, and after queen b3, bishop f6, gf6. It may appear that white achieved something, weakened the black king, but in fact this will only help black, because after h5 the bishop can be activated via h6. White cannot really take advantage of the opening of the g file, because black's heavy pieces are dominating the position. The knight is pinned and the d5 pawn is relatively weak and can be attacked. King g2, probably played in time trouble, because after this white is tied up after rook c3, but objectively speaking the position is lost for white. As I said, the knight on d3 is lacking stable squares, d5 pawn is weak, and last but not the least, the a6 passed pawn is a very strong factor in this position, which means that any exchange of queens coupled with the pawn weaknesses makes the position technically winning one for black. So king g2 and now rook c3. The pin is devastating. After rook d1, h5. Finally we see that the bishop is getting into the game. King h3, bishop h6. With the bishop already activated now and completely dominating the position, black is now ready to start pushing his a pawn. And white just decided to go va-bank, but okay, rook e1 just loses a piece because this is easily parried by rook e3. So a very instructive game, I would say, by the world champion, with some decisions which were not perhaps objectively the best, but ones that definitely put pressure on his opponent. I always like analyzing the games of the world champion, because one of the most fascinating aspects of his play is that ability that I mentioned of constantly being able to improve his position. And in this game we also saw this on a few occasions, how he was constantly finding ways to further improve his position. And also don't forget the nice disruptive move bishop g4 in the opening. Very good game, very instructive game, and also a game important for the theory of the Fianchetto line, and one which you should use as complement, as a complementary study material to the theoretical chapter, where we actually concentrated more on the a4 line in the opening rather than the knight d2 allowing b5. A great game once again for the world champion. Thanks for watching this model game. Thank you. Hello and welcome to my Chessable Move Trainer course on the Najdorf. In this model game between Nigel Short and Levon Aronian, we will be exploring some typical pawn structures that can arise after the exchange of the bishops on the e6 square. After the usual Najdorf moves, e4, c5, knight f3, d6, d4, cd, knight d4, knight f6, knight c3, a6, Nigel Short goes for the move a3. He has played this move before, and probably this means that Aronian was prepared, but what is more surprising here is that Aronian is not a Najdorf player, not even a Sicilian player. After his, I noticed actually a change in tendency in his repertoire choices after his debacle at the Berlin candidates last year, which saw a drastic change of his repertoire. As white, he started playing e4 and started playing the main lines. Whereas with black, he has all his life been a Ruy Lopez or Spanish player, but lately he has also included other openings in his repertoire, and in this game we see him playing the Najdorf. What is great about these great players is that they can, even though they may not be a natural or lifelong players of an opening, they can easily pick up any opening and treat it in an exemplary manner. So we will see in this game Aronian, not a Najdorf player at all, play a very instructive game against a lifelong Sicilian player, Nigel Short. So A3. We are dealing with the theory of this move in the theoretical chapter. As I mentioned, we are analyzing this game not because of its theoretical importance, but rather because of the middle game positions that will arise. So E5. A reminder, in the theoretical chapter I actually suggest the move E6 here. Knight F3. I think more critical is the move Knight F5, as it has been played by Carlsen, if for nothing else. But Knight F3 also has some idea, because similarly to the line with A4, E5, Knight F3, the idea is to put the bishops on C4 and G5 without the intermediate stop to E2 or E3. So white wants to play bishop C4 and bishop G5 in one move. So with his next move, Aronian is stopping bishop G5 and aims to meet bishop C4 with bishop E6. We have seen this reaction in the analysis of the English attack, the line bishop E3, E5, Knight F3, to meet bishop E6, bishop C4 with bishop E6. But here it is even a better version for black, because H6 has already been played, so he will never need to worry about a possible exchange on E6 and the move Knight G5. White decides to take a questionable decision, because after F6 we arrive at the pawn structure that we will be exploring in this game. I have more on one occasion stressed that this is a very good structure for black, because the pawn on E6 covers the very important F5 and D5 squares, and with these squares controlled, it is difficult to see what white can do in this position, what active plans he has at his disposal. We will shortly see what Short came up with, but it's worth noting that black has easy play here. After bishop E7, the knight can be developed on D7, on C6, the queen can come out, and then black will continue with either queenside play by B5, Knight B6, Knight C4, or sometimes even kingside play, Knight H5, Knight F4, and so on. Short castled Short. That's a nice sentence. And after Knight D7, it was obviously possible to put the knight on C6, which controls the D4 square and in a way limits the movement of the knight from F3. But Aronian decided to put the knight on D7, and now we will see what Short intended with the move Knight E1. It's probably too much to say, but I still think that black is already better here. And again, it's not so much of the actual assessment of the position, but rather the prospects either side has here. And the prospects are very much in black's favor. As I explained, black can continue improving his position by various means, whereas the same cannot be said for white. White can play some neutral looking moves like H3, bishop E3, maybe double on maybe put queen D2, rook D1, but then what next? There is nothing to attack, no active play, whereas black has quite a lot of active play in the typical Sicilian manner, for example B5, or the knight transfer to C4, and so on and so on. So what Short comes up with is the plan of Knight D1, Knight D3 and F4. So he's in a way trying to break the grip this pawn structure has on the center, but at the same time this is a weakening plan by white, because it weakens the E4 pawn. A typical move to examine in these structures is the move knight h4, typical especially after h6 has been played because it weakens the g6 square. And now the move that black should not fear playing is the move king f7. It covers the g6 square, and on the next move black will play g5, forcing the knight to go back, and then we'll continue bishop e7, king g7, rook f8, and then possibilities to play on the king side are opened. Queen e8, queen g6, knight h5, knight f4, etc. As you can see, this very robust center secures black against any possible counterplay in the center by white, and he can calmly prepare play on the flank. The tactical justification is that white cannot really open the game here against the king, because after f4, e4, whichever way he takes on f4, loses a piece to g5. So, knight e1. Bishop e7, black continues development normally, knight d3, and now short castle. Finishing development, and now black is ready, whether to push d5, whether to play something else, queen c7, knight b6, b5, and so on, all the typical Sicilian moves. So, short continues with his plan to push through f4, but now we have some very instructive moments in the game coming up. The first move, queen c7. It's not just finishing development, it is also a move that intends to further activate the queen by putting it on c4. With the knight on d3, the queen is very difficult to dislodge from c4, and it will be very annoying there attacking the e4 pawn. And now king h1. Now, the move queen c7, apart from intending to improve his position, is also notable because black does not mind the doubling on his pawns on the e file. And we must explore these positions, because I have repeatedly said that these are favorable for black, but now we must see how this works in practice and see it concretely what this means. So after f5, knight e5, knight e5, d5, we arrive at this typical position. Now, what are these pawns doing? They're controlling all the important squares on the d and f files. f4, f5, d4, d5. With all these pawns, with all these squares controlled, black can now start maneuvering his pieces to take advantage of the d4 and f4 squares. The control of d5 and f5 renders the knight on c3 very passive, without any possible prospects, and the e4 pawn is a rather weak one. This is shown after, let's say, bishop e3, queen c4. Now we see the other idea of queen c7. The queen is very well placed on c4, attacking the e4 pawn. Defending the pawn after queen d3, rook c8, further shows the easiness of black's play and the difficulty in white's play. What can white do in this position? For example, h3, preventing knight g4 ideas, rook d8, forcing exchange of queens, queen c4, rook c4, and the pawn on e4 falls. 19 moves, black is winning. Let's explore additional options on move 16 after d5. What can white do here? For example, the natural move king h1, getting the king out of the diagonal, loses on the spot to knight g4. Knight f2 is threatened, the knight cannot be taken. If required, black can further increase his presence on the dark squares by playing a move like queen b6. This is shown in the line. If queen e2, then check first, king h1 and knight g4, again winning. Knight f2 is difficult to stop. So, as you can see, it's almost impossible to find a decent move for white here. So on move 15, with two doubled pawns in the center, black is close to winning. So it's very important that you also, apart from concretely analyzing this position, if possible, to try to feel why this position is so good for for black. So, a lifelong Sicilian player, Short obviously knew about dangers facing him if he exchanged on e5, so he played king h1, not refraining from this exchange, and Aronian continues with the move queen c4. That was planned and putting more pressure on the e4 pawn. White defends with queen e1, and now Aronian played the move knight c5. The move is good enough, keeps the advantage by all means, but there was a better and objectively stronger possibility, and that was the move knight h5. Again, this is a very instructive line, and we will explore it in more detail. Knight h5 attacks f4, so white is forced to take, so fe, knight e5. Now, we already analyzed the positions after knight e5, d5. Nothing has changed there. The difference is, okay, knight e5 actually cannot be played because rook f1 is mate. But in any case, even if white prepares the capture on e5, we already saw that this is very favorable. Whereas, after something like queen e2, rook f1, queen f1, what I wanted to explore is the position with this small center e6, d6. I have mentioned this small center on more than one occasion, and have said that the small center provides excellent play for black thanks to the control of all the important squares along the fifth rank. And here we see what this means in practice. Knight f6, of course the knight has to go back because it had nothing to do anymore on h5, and something like, let's say, queen e2, and now knight fb7. So just notice how harmonious black's position is. Many active possibilities appear. The rook can come to c8, can come to f8. The bishop will be activated via f6, and the typical Sicilian play of b5, a5, b4 will follow. So again, it may be useful for you to start moving the pieces around a little bit on your own, and try to feel the easiness of play for black and the difficulty in finding decent moves for white. Again, what's hurting white is that long term his position is rather prospectless, whereas black has many ways to improve his position and push forward. Going back to the game position, knight c5, as I said, good enough, keeping the advantage, just that, okay, objectively speaking, knight h5 was better. So knight c5 attacks the knight on d3, and after knight c5, queen c5, white played the move bishop d2, which was not the best one. Best was actually to play f5 to prevent the exchange on f4, but after f5 anyway, ef, rook f5, knight g4 was still pretty good for black. Still, white has problems with the f2 square. Now we have a different structure in the center, d6, e5 against e4, and it may appear that white, at least strategically, is fine because there are light square weaknesses, but here the problem is in the various different degree of activity of the pieces. White has concrete problems with the f2 pawn and probably is forced to play something like knight d1, but can never dream of taking advantage of the d5 square. Anyway, this was better because after bishop d2, the rest of the game is a wonderful demonstration of Aronian's technique. So first of all, ef, bishop d2, ef4. So not eliminating the possibility of f5, and again obtaining this small center and isolating the pawn on e4. So ef4, rook f4, and now a strong move g5. He's basically securing the e5 square by controlling the f4 square. Also, as the rook has to go, he wins the g4 square for the typical knight maneuver, knight g4, knight e5. This is already move 19, and strategically black is winning. All the factors working in his favor are the ones I mentioned. The small center controls all the squares, e5 is weak, e4 is weak. And black has many ways to improve his position. Knight e5, exchange of rooks, bishop f6, the other rook can come to c8 to f8. The traditional Sicilian play of b5, a5, b4 is still there, whereas white is passive on all fronts and he has to only wait. Not wanting to wait and preventing the threat of knight f2, white does what he probably considered the least of evils, but bishop e3, offering the exchange of the invaluable dark squared bishop for a knight, is more or less equivalent to a positional resignation, because after knight e3, rook e3, bishop f6, we see the domination of the powerful dark squared bishop over the knight. The knight has no squares to go to, whereas the bishop is dominating the position. It can be placed on e5, from where it controls both the king side and the queen side. Rook d1 and bishop e5. The ideal square from where the bishop defends d6, looks both ways, king side, queen side, and dominates the whole position. Rook d3. It may appear at first sight that that white is solid. After all, he has only one weakness, the e4 pawn, which is safely defended. He has a relatively safe king, so okay, maybe he can hold, yeah. But this is the problem with being passive in the Sicilian as white, that black has always ways to be active. Black, it is inherent in the dynamism of the black position, and actually in the opening itself, the Sicilian in general and Najdorf in particular, that there is always some potential in black's position, always some ways to improve, always some ways to create problems, take over the initiative. In this case, what black will use to increase his advantage is his typical Sicilian play by advancing the pawns on the queen side. So something like b5, a5, b4 will dislodge the knight from c3, and then black will take it from there, whether penetrating along the a file or attacking b2, fixing c2. Many possibilities will appear. So rook ac8, first of all putting the rook onto semi-open file, h3. Not really clear that it improves the position of the king, because the king cannot use the h2 square, but as we said, white is completely passive and he can only wait. And now queen b6. Basically a matter of taste. He could have probably gone b5, but queen b6 is a typical, you could say, educated technical move, because it probes for weaknesses. So it attacks b2. It attacks b2, and white finds it difficult to defend it. So for example, if b3, then maybe queen a5, then probing for more weaknesses, and if a4, b5 for example, or queen c5. And just attacking the pawns and waiting for some opening to appear. Instead of b3, short opted for b4, but then this is attacked by a5. Actually, quite quickly, black managed to create further weaknesses in white's camp. So queen d1, just making a move, I suppose, because it is possible to take the pawn, but then again the alternatives are not better. For example, ba5, queen a5, it just ruins the structure, and b5 can be bet maybe by rook c4 or queen c5. It just it's so easy to pile up here with playing with black. So queen d1, ab, and now of course it is possible to take on b4. Nothing is really threatened. But Aronian takes another route. He goes rook f6. What he intends to do is to double on the f file and threaten rook f1. So now, having created a weakness on the queen side, he's switching flanks and starts play on the king side. It's a very, very instructive technical manner of playing in this way. So, knight e2, trying to aid the king side if possible, but after rook c f8, the threat of rook f1 forces the move rook f3, and after the exchange rook f3 gf, now the queen penetrates on f2. It appears as black is playing sort of a cat and mouse game, because he could have picked up a free pawn on the queen side, but he decided no, against it. he started playing on the king side. Now he created huge weaknesses there as well. The threat is mating 1 and wins material there as well. F4 preventing mate, but GF, queen G1 forcing the exchange of queens, but of course the endgame is completely winning for black. Not only he has a material advantage, but he also has a positional advantage because all these pawns are extremely weak. And the rest of the game is rather easy and straightforward, especially for a player of Aronion's stature. So knight f3, rook c2, b5. Okay, the pawn can be white can take on e5 at any moment, just playing b5. Okay, and the moves don't really make a difference here because black will start picking up more pawns. So rook b2, knight e5, d5, check, check, and rook b7. At least white got a passed pawn, but then again he's losing the pawn on e4. So rook b4, b6, rook e4, rook b8. Always rook behind the pawn, b7. Just the only thing not to do here is to blunder rook f8, check, and queen. So king g7, the only move, but one that is sufficient. And now white's rook is without moves, and these two pawns will easily decide if they start rolling. So Shor decides to exchange the b7 pawn for the e6 pawn, but that leaves him clearly with 2 pawns down. And the rest is, as I said, elementary. So check and rook e1. The idea is to perhaps a good moment to mention this typical mechanism of advancing the pawns without the help of the king, which is putting the rook on e3 first, then f3, e4, rook e2, f2, e3, rook e1, f1. So in this manner, it's like an automatic movement of the pawns, and the only way it can be stopped is by putting a king in front of the pawns, which is what Shor does by king f3. But even if this doesn't help, of course, h5, removing the pawn from the attack by the rook, h4, okay, check, and now the pawns start rolling. Okay, back f3, the pawns start to go. Now the king is approached, otherwise king f7 could have been played. Rook h5, getting 1 pawn back, but then the pawns decide just because they create mating threats. Here, king g7, and white resign because e3 will follow, and then rook a1. A fantastic game by Aronian, you could say. Really difficult to say what Shor did wrong. His plan of knight e1, knight d3 did create some weaknesses, but then again, the manner in which Aronian managed to outplay him, the apparent easiness with which he won the game. Basically, he was strategically winning by move before move 20 with black. And also, I think the analysis of these typical structures, double pawns on e6, e5, and the analysis of the small center, I think are very valuable for understanding these positions and getting a better understanding of the Najdorf as a whole, because these positions can frequently arise from various variations. So the Najdorf is not only theory, memorization, and so on, but as I keep repeating in this course, a lot of it is based on understanding. So these typical structures, typical reactions, typical motives, irrelevant from which variations they occur, they should be studied, they should be understood, and then employed. And what is even more impressive, at least for me, is that this exemplary game by Aronian was played by a player who is not a Najdorf player. Which, okay, maybe is an illustration that players of the highest level who understand chess so deeply, they can grasp these nuances, these details, and apply them immediately when they see them in front of them during a game. Fantastic game. I hope you learned a lot by analyzing it. I surely did. So I thank you for watching this very good exemplary model game. Thank you. Hello and welcome to my Chessable Move Trainer course on the Najdorf. This model game, the game between Dejan Pikula and Kirill Georgiev, is the latest addition to the chapter. And in this game we will be exploring the structures that arise from the currently very popular line with h3. So after the opening moves, e4, c5, knight f3, d6, d4, cd, knight d4, knight f6, knight c3, a6, the move h3 is currently perhaps the most frequently played move against the Najdorf, and in this game we will be exploring the pawn structures and the typical middle game and endgame positions arising from our proposed theoretical line following e6 and d5. So the game follows the mainstream theory. After ed, knight d5, knight d2, bishop b4, bishop g2, castles, castle. Of course, the alternatives are well dealt with in the theoretical chapter. So knight c3, queen c7, queen d4. And now we actually have a deviation from our proposed repertoire, where we analyze the more precise move knight c6, and then after queen c4 we go bishop d6, whereas in this game Kirill Georgiev goes for the move bishop d6 immediately. Of course it is possible to play like this, but the reason I decided against it was that here bishop e3 is quite an annoying move. The tempting move knight e4 played by Pikula actually is not that good, even though it wins the tempo, because after bishop e7, sorry, knight e4, after bishop e7, bishop e3, now Georgiev uses the fact that the long diagonal is blocked, so he uses this in order to play the very important developing move bishop d7. So even though this is not directly relevant for our repertoire, the game is a fantastic example how these positions should be treated and how they can be won. So the first very important movement, if possible, Black would ideally like to oppose his light squared bishop on the long diagonal. So in this case, ideally putting it on c6. After queen b6, this was White's idea, to exchange queens, fix Black's structure on the queen side and start pushing his own majority. Queen b6, bishop b6, bishop c6. We can slowly start to see where both players are going. Please note the extreme importance of the bishop on c6. It does not only oppose the bishop on g2 along the long diagonal, it does not only defend the vulnerable b7 pawn, but it also stops pretty much forever White's queenside expansion. So obviously being a bishop, it also serves in a way as a pawn, which makes the position 3 against 3 on the queen side. So how is White going to create a passed pawn there? So this, the importance of the defensive importance of the bishop on c6 cannot be overvalued. For the time being, White just continues playing the normal moves. c4, okay, it appears normal. Yeah, I mean, he just wants to maybe put some rooks in the center and start advancing his majority. But very soon we will discover that this is impossible. Knight d7, finishing development, chasing the bishop away from b6, from where it's controlling the d8 square. Bishop d4, and now another very important moment, a5. Why is this important? Because together with the bishop on e7, the pawn on a5 is creating a barricade on the dark squares, effectively preventing the advance of White's queenside majority. Now, a3 with the idea to push b4 would be a very bad move, because after a4, White's queenside structure will be crippled. Whereas playing b3 makes it still difficult to play a3, b4, because first of all, a3 would render the rook on a1 passive, because it will be tied down to the defense of the a3 pawn. And then again, b4 is not so easy to achieve, because it is controlled both by the pawn and by the bishop. So a very important move to play on the queen side, and one to remember. So White continues with normal moves, rook fd1, rook fd8. This was made possible because the bishop was was chased away from b6, and now b3. Okay, obviously white understood that a3 is impossible, but b3 again looks like a normal move, connecting the pawns. Maybe in some future he will try a3, but although not very likely. But at least white's position looks very solid, without any weaknesses, good centralization. What can possibly go wrong here for white? However, as we have also noted in the previous games, it is all a matter of prospects and tendency. Which from the two players has more chances of activating his majority, white or black? We already discussed white's chances to start pushing his pawns, and we saw that those chances are practically non-existent. The same cannot be said for black. Black has many ways to start pushing his pawns. One is to push e5, and the other one is to push f5. And these are not only impossible to stop, but also difficult to deal with, because either of them is a possible option for black, and white needs to take care of both. So in a long-term perspective, long-term prospects are with black. And we saw how important these long-term prospects are in the game. They give clarity to the player playing with these clear prospects, whereas the player lacking these prospects is left without a plan, and this affects him both psychologically and practically. So black starts with the move f6, not showing his hand. Black still keeps both options open, either e5 or f5. It also, in a way, tempts white to move the bishop from d4 by playing bishop e3, because perhaps white is anticipating e5, so he's removing the bishop in time and exerting more control over the d file. Perhaps white was expecting e5, which would not have been best for black, because after knight c3 we see the point of white's prophylactic move bishop e3. After e5 the d5 square has been weakened, and then the knight can safely slot in there on d5, with or without the exchange. For example, bishop g2, king g2 also doesn't really help black, because knight d5 knight b5 would both be possible, and also e5 is not good from another perspective, which especially after the exchange of the light squared bishops, puts more pawns on dark squares, therefore limiting his own bishop, even though his main task here is on the a3 fa diagonal. But the main point of e5 not being desirable is that it weakens the light squares. So, very nice prophylactic move, but it appears that it was based on a miscalculation. At least that's the impression I get. Removing the bishop from d4 relinquishes control of the e5 square. So knight e5 is definitely a move to be considered, because the immediate threat is to put something on d3, either a rook or a knight. So black is immediately taking advantage of white's last move. But at first sight, and possibly this was white's hope or miscalculation, it appears that it just loses a pawn, because the removal of the knight from d7 also relinquishes control of the b6 square. So after the exchange of rooks and bishop b6, it appears that white is winning a pawn. However, again, miscalculation by Pikula, or better calculation by Georgiev, or both. After the next move, rook d3, we see that white was wrong to assume that he was winning a pawn. The justification being that after bishop a5, black has the simple knight f3. That knight must be taken because the knight d4 is hanging, bishop f3, rook f3, and with a, again, strategically winning position, because the knight on e4 is hanging, the pawn on h3 is hanging, and in this position with the pair of bishops, this is a technically winning position for black. For example, knight g3 can be met by bishop c5, and then both the knight on g3 and pawn on f2 are hanging. If this was the case, a miscalculation, it is a very good example where we see how the quality of our decisions is directly dependent on the quality of our calculations. If White had seen that this is not possible, he would probably not have played bishop e3 in the first place. As it is, here he was forced to admit his mistake by going back to e3, but this is already admitting that everything he was striving for was just based on a mistake, and now Black is clearly dominating, not only controlling the open file, but after his very instructive next move, he's taking over the initiative on the whole board. Again, globally speaking, the game was decided in this very moment by this, I would say, miscalculation by White. And what follows next is actually a very good demonstration of Black's technique. Kirill Georgiev is a very technical player, very good at it. And we will also see a good demonstration of the power of the bishop pair. But first things first. The next move is very, very important, a4. So, using the fact that the rook on d3 is very active, Black is using his a-pawn to create a weakness on b3. In a way typical for the Sicilian, but even though the structure is not really typical for the Sicilian, but this minority attack of 2 pawns attacking 3 on the queen side is something a Sicilian player should be quite used to. Here the attack is done by the a-pawn, and the goal is to create a weakness on b3. So taking on a4 would be horrible, obviously, because all pawns would be just a mess. So White defends the pawn, and after take, f5. Now we see which pawn break this Black decided to do. Obviously e5 here was not possible, but the point of f5 is to chase away the knight from e4, because when the knight moves away, the move knight f3 will win the bishop pair. So I'm pretty sure Georgiev made his decision before moving f5, but to understand it better, let's just make a few more moves, gf, ef, knight g3, and now we have a characteristic decision. Characteristic in the sense that it gives us a clear understanding of the player's understanding of chess and player's manner of play. Here the choice is obviously g6, defending the pawn on f5, limiting the knight on g3, but allowing the exchange of bishops. Still an excellent position for Black. And the alternative is the one Georgiev played, which is knight f3, winning the bishop pair, so knight f3, bishop f3, bishop f3, but sacrificing a pawn. This sacrifice, I would say, is very instructive, because by sacrificing this pawn, apart from winning the bishop pair, Black actually gave this extra pawn to White, which is where? On the queen side. But we already saw the importance of the bishop. It was on c6, now it's on f3, but it's doing the same function. What I'm trying to say is that these 2 pawns will never make a passed pawn, thanks to that bishop on c6, which served as a pawn, like I said, making it 2 against 2, but doing the same function from f3. So in effect, even though formally speaking Black is a pawn down, in practice not really. And also in practice he has the very powerful bishops here, which will soon start to use to a great effect. Kirill Georgiev is a very good also positional player, and he values highly the pair of bishops, and in this game he gives excellent demonstration how to use them. Bishop f6. Okay, the bishop is positioned on the long diagonal. Knight g3 and bishop e5. It's very instructive to see how he slowly improves the position of all his pieces. The threat is now to take on g3 or e3 to win material, so White is defending by rook e1. It is possible to take on b3, but Georgiev just squeezes the position even further by first playing bishop c3, and when the rook moves away, bishop b4. Now the threat is to take on b3. Obviously the position is rather desperate for white, so he decides to abandon the pawn immediately by pushing c5. However, it is instructive to see what happens after rook b1. So now the pawn cannot be taken, and even though there is this possibility of bishop d1 and taking that pawn eventually, but I rather suspect that black would have played something more sadistic like g6, limiting the knight, and then slowly playing, centralizing the king, playing h5, h4. Then when the knight is chased away, maybe king f5, and so on. Advancing on the whole board, when sooner or later he would have won some pawn, whether that be h3 or b3 pawn. It would have been only a matter of time, because after such total advance on the whole board, it's impossible. Against such total advance, it's impossible to defend. So c5, kind of desperation. And now another typical moment, g6. The pawn will not run away. What is important is to limit white as much as possible. So, with the knight completely without prospects on g3, white plays knight f1. The idea is to somehow activate that knight by knight h2 and knight g4. So now black picks up the pawn, knight h2, bishop c6, the favorite spot for the bishop in this game, knight g4. So the knight now is a tad more active on g4, but not for long, especially after the following move, bishop c3. The bishops are basically raging. Yeah, the bishop on c3 is now controlling e5, f6, so the knight again will be pushed backwards, especially after a move like h5. So in order to avoid that, he gives the check, but after king f8, the knight really has nothing to do on the rim. So rook d1, threatening rook d8, so bishop f6, preventing that, knight g4, and now bishop g7. Now the check on d8 is met by king e7, and the rook needs to go back, and the bishop on g7 still continues to limit the knight. Now h5 will push the knight even further back, so white doesn't wait for it, goes back to h2 immediately. So we saw that all this maneuver, knight f1, knight h2, how it ended. Sadly, the knight went to h6, but then went back to h2. And now it's already time to determine how to win this game. In fact, the plan is relatively simple. If black manages to exchange rooks, then the pawn on c5 will be impossible to defend, because the king can easily come to d5. The dark squared bishops can easily attack that pawn, and even if white manages to somehow defend it by knight, that knight can be attacked either by a king or by black's light squared bishop, and the pawn on c5 will fall. When that pawn falls, black will have a passed b pawn, which will decide the game by simply advancing, and then either the pawn will advance or win the knight, or will distract the king, white's king, to the queen side, in which case black's king will march to the king side and pick up the remaining pawns there. So this is the general scenario how the game should be won. So Georgiev immediately steps on the path of that plan by playing rook a3 and introducing the idea of rook a1 to exchange the rooks. Knight f1, it stops the idea for the time being, but black is in no rush. King f7, slowly improving the position. Knight d2, king e6. As I said, no rush to play rook a1. King f1, so one check, another check, repeating the moves, and now rook a1. Simply continuing the plan. After this exchange, the game follows the scenario I just described. f3, bishop b5 check, king d5, already rounding up the pawn, knight b3, attacking the bishop, bishop c3, h4, and now bishop d3. Again, the plan is simple. The bishop will will come to b4, attacking the knight, the pawn on c5, and then either bishop c2, bishop c4, king c4 will attack the knight, and when the knight moves, the pawn will be lost. So in order to, in a way, distract black from this plan, white plays h5, but that just grants black a free passed pawn on the h file. So now the game shifts to the king side, because then there white has the black has the easy play of just simply pushing the pawn. King g3. Okay, white tries to activate the king, but this is short-lived. Bishop g6 defending the pawn, and now the pawn goes forward. King g3 and bishop e1. Of course, the pawn will never be taken. And now black is basically combining play on both sides of the board, in a way, play on two weaknesses. The first weakness is this strong passed pawn on the h file. So weakness is not always just a weakness, it can be a strength of the opponent, in this case the passed pawn. So that's the one weakness on the king side, and the other one is the real weakness of the pawn on c5, which ties down at least one of white's pieces. So knight d4, okay, playing for some tricks, maybe if king c5, maybe knight c2, winning a piece, but black is not really interested in that. He has the clear plan of advancing the h pawn. Bishop e8, the threat is bishop d7. You see how the bishops are very powerful in an open position. So knight e2, king c4. It was of course possible to give the check, but king c4, now the threat is king d3, winning a piece. So the knight has to move, but now bishop f7. Again, it was possible to give check, but Georgiev again is playing on domination, because the bishop on f7 limits the knight on f4. Slowly but surely, white is running out of moves. So bishop g1, bishop g3 attacking the knight, moving the knight, and now check. The king has to go, the bishop goes back. And this will be followed by h3, possibly h2, and also the plan to pick up the c5 pawn is still valid. An incredible technical performance by Kirill Georgiev, I would say, who masterfully took advantage of white's miscalculation in the early endgame, and then showed how these simplified and at first sight easy positions can be won in a rather smooth manner. What I would like to draw your attention to here is the importance of the bishop d7, bishop c6 maneuver in these structures, because the bishop on c6 is stabilizing the whole queen side, not only defensively, but also, as we saw, can be used offensively, if not exchanged for the opposing bishop on g2. As we saw in this game, black took advantage of the bishop on c6 by planting a knight on f3. I just can say that you should take some time studying this game, because it's not only a good lesson in how to treat these structures which can arise from our repertoire, but also for general chess understanding. I would say it's a very good technical game, and you can pick up a lot of technical motives, technical manners from this game, because from such a strong player like Kirill Georgiev. So this concludes our analysis of this model game. Very instructive one, very impressive one, at least I remember to include it in the model game chapter after I remembered it, because I have known this game for a very long time. It made a strong impression on me ever since it was played, and I hope it also made a strong impression on you. Thank you for watching.